Hi, I'm Principleasure. Today we're at the old Hit Factory Studios in South East London. We're going to be going through some of the mixes of my debut album, One, using Cubase 10. The handwork came together relatively easily. I did the tracking at a studio in Berlin called Handwerk Studios, which unfortunately is no longer around, and I was fortunate enough to have access to 4 or 5 different synthesizers. I had the Jupiter 8, the Elka Synthex, the Roland SH101, and the Korg Mono. And it was mixed at the Red Room in Moloko, essentially using Cubase as a tape machine. So what I ended up with were 16 stems, and even though there's been some preliminary work done on this, the vast majority of what you see is kind of how it was tracked at Handwerk. So hopefully that'll be useful to show you how I cut elements up and how I bring them into sort of 8-bar loops and build a track up from that. So we're starting with these synth tracks up at the top here. We've got the Jupiter 8 and we've got a couple of tracks here which I'll solo. Jupiter 8 Additional and Jupiter 8. And these are kind of These were done using the clock out from the 808 to trigger the internal Jupiter 8 arpeggiator, and I just randomly basically played a combination of chords which were in key with the track. In terms of processing, there really isn't much done in here. I've just sort of created this high-pass filter by taking everything out below about 50 Hertz using the standard Cubase EQ. I'm using this plugin Nux, which I developed myself actually, and it's this is being used for the delays. The very cool thing about this plugin is that you can take any of the effects parameters and modulate them in their own sequencer lane on this grid. So if you wanted to take like the delay left and right times and the delay feedback, you could literally change it according to the grid position. I haven't really done that in this track. I've used it without the sequencer in a really basic way to create this sort of like spinning stereo delay effect. Maybe I should play around a little with the feedback and the times and sort of see how that looks. Yeah, so it's quite cool when you start playing with all that sort of stuff. So yeah, that's the Jupiter 8. That's playing this kind of lead line, arpeggiated line across everything. We've also got, we printed the Jupiter 8 through the Eventide H3000 reverb as well, so I have the reverb tails from that. And if I play those alongside the original, you can hear how they sort of play in. Again, not much done to this. Basic high-pass filter. It's such a lovely reverb. That and the Valhalla Shimmer are the 2 main reverbs I used on the record. But in keeping with the sort of analog, vintage aesthetic, I tried to do as much outboard processing as possible. And certainly some of the stems were run through some of the preamps and EQs that you see in this room, and also the H3000 and the other Eventide processors at the Red Room in Moloko. So when I bring those together, it sounds pretty cool. Next, we've got this Elka Synthex part here, which is kind of playing the drones, and I'm going to play this along with the Jupiter 8. This was just kind of played in. The Elka I was using, I'm not sure if it had MIDI, so there wasn't really much done to this. I used this really primitive plugin that Steve Duda made called LFO Tool, and it just acts as a kind of a sidechain without sounding too sidechain, if that makes sense. It just kind of volume ducks everything, and if I bypass that and bring that back in, you can sort of see what that's doing. And this is the Elka Synthex and the Jupiter 8 playing in with each other. Then I have the Synthex string, and one of the cool things about the Elka Synthex is it does this random panning thing where basically it goes from channel to channel. If you bounce things into mono, sometimes you lose some of that. It doesn't do summing very well, stereo summing, but as a standalone stereo track, it's really nice. And using analog synths, you'll notice a lot of this stuff has been tracked in stereo. The Jupiter 8 doesn't really have a dedicated left and right as far as I'm aware. It just has an upper and lower part, but it's really interesting how the 2 stereo channels play in together. So everything's done in stereo, and if needs be, I'll use like a mono stereo processor within Cubase to either take something back to mono or widen it out as a mono effect into a stereo effect. So yeah, the Synthex just kind of plays a string part and a drone in the breaks and just kind of goes along and does its own thing quite nicely. Again, that went through an Eventide reverb as well, which predictably has been high-pass filtered. So what we have here is a combination of the two kind of main lead synth sounds with a bunch of reverb underneath. Next we have this Korg Mono playing this really generic wind sound. I don't really like using these. These are just kind of, I guess, the icing on the cake. I've reversed it here to create some of the break effects you hear, and duplicated it and slightly filtered it to create another effect sound which kind of heralds in new sections in the track. Most of these components you'll see are broken down into 8-bar or 4-bar loops. In the Korg reverb here, you'll see that it hasn't even really been kind of cut to any particular size. What I tend to do when I reverse these parts is I'll just kind of like jam it in really and just sort of see where it fits into the track. If I have to leave a couple of bars, I'll do that sometimes. If I have to leave like 1 bar, it just really depends on the essence of the track. And when I bring the other elements in, you'll sort of see how that's kind of fitting in and why I've shaped that as I have done. You'll also notice that there's another reverse effect here which sort of plays through the final 2.5 bars before everything else drops in again. Again, not really any particular reason for doing it that way. Sometimes I'll leave, it's a bit of an obvious trick, but sometimes I'll leave like a beat before everything kicks back in. And that's kind of what I've done here. I've got this Korg Mono sound just sort of playing through the 8 bars of the first breakdown. And if I unsolo everything and put it back in, you'll sort of hear how that sounds. And you'll see there's no automation here, there's nothing clever going on. This is literally all kind of done by hand. I would do multiple passes of this and just compile a take, which I would feel is the take to bring with me. So much of this stuff has been so roughly chopped. I mean, you literally have the same 4-bar drone here on the Korg Mono playing through the entire track. Sometimes I don't even bother like crossfading this stuff or fading it out or fading it in, even though Cubase is really good for that. You know, I just leave things organic and as they're meant to be, really. Okay, so going into the next synth part, we've got the SH-101, which plays an integral part in this record, not just in this song, but in every track in the album. It's something that I've just used for years, since, you know, for 10 years since I got mine, over 10 years, 15 years I've had that synth. This figure was really interesting because that sound changes quite a lot through the course of the track. So it started life as an 8-bar, as a 2-bar MIDI pattern, which has been compiled as a series of different filtered 8-bar loops. So in some sections I'm filtering it up, in some sections I'm bringing up the LFO modulation, prolonging the release, bringing a filter down. So there's about 4 or 5 different passes of it in here, and it's also been layered with an additional part which kind of gives it some thickness towards the end and kind of adds to the chaos of that sound and just doubles it up. The 101 has been fed through this group track here, which uses this old trick, which isn't rocket science, but quite clever when you're using mono sound sources. A lot of users out there would probably suggest staying away from a stereo bass sound, but in this case it's kind of somewhere between a bass and a lead, so I saw no harm in turning that into a stereo track and bringing the width up slightly. And if we play that in isolation and we take it out, you'll see that it's quite a dull mono track, and when we ramp it up to stereo, it's got quite a bit of width in it. Cubase lets you go really wide with this, but I generally keep the width probably around 11, 12 o'clock to make sure I'm not overdoing things that don't disappear in mono. The 101 again has been passed through a reverb unit. I think this was an AMT reverb, which Moloko had. It doesn't really sound like much in isolation, and there's not a great deal of processing on that part, but when you hear it in the context of the track, you'll see that there's some quite clever stuff going on there. With the 101 being an analog synth, a true analog synth, you're going to get quite a lot of low-end energy that unexpectedly might fill up the track or just get in the way of things. So I did this kind of minor high pass fade below around 20 hertz just to get rid of some of those frequencies. Waves L2, old favorite. It's doing a little bit of limiting there just to catch some of those peaks. I generally tend to have the attenuation between sort of -3 and -6 dB. This API 2000 compressor from Waves, again, sounds pretty good. I'd rather have had the original, and certainly on many tracks on the album, I have used the original. In this case, it just made sense to have the compressor playing in real time along with the track. So let's get some of these other tracks soloed so you can hear how the 101 plays along with the other sounds in here. And we've got the 808, predictably playing 16s. I'm using Nux again on here with this death metal setting, which is basically just 3 distortions and 2 distortions, high shelf for some top end EQ and a compressor over the top of it. And if I bring the gain up, sorry, I'll bring this back. You can see that this kind of just decimates the hi-hats a bit, just makes them sound a bit harsher and more kind of in that EDM, electronic body music realm. So yeah, that's a favorite thing I like to put in my cymbals. Sometimes I'll drop out some of the top end energy. I use the TR-606 quite a lot on this record, and it's quite toppy, around 10K. So I would create some kind of low pass filter by just kind of filtering out the highs using Cubase EQ, which over the years has improved dramatically and is one of my mainstays. High pass filtering again here. This notch down here at 500 might be because there were components of a percussive hit or a snare in there somewhere recorded along with the 808 or some kind of mains hum. Like I say, when I did this stuff, I didn't really pay too much attention to the purity of the original sound sources, particularly as some of it was done on the fly. And in this particular track, I was in Antwerp for 2 days to do 5 album cuts, which was a crazy amount of work. And I think when I was setting up the 808, there was like all sorts of crazy mains hum and shit going on. So 808 congas here, playing this pattern with the Steinberg Roomworks reverb, which I've used this for years, and it's definitely one of my favorite reverbs. I don't use any of the presets, I just kind of create my own. Reverb time usually set around 0.8 to 1 second. You'll notice that it's on the insert. I've been putting my reverbs and delays in the insert bus for as long as I can remember. I don't generally tend to put them as sends. Just gives me more control. I don't really see the point in being restricted to a handful of sends when you have all these different inserts here, and you can have a different reverb essentially on each channel. There's a little bit, the mix is around about the 25% mark, which sounds about right for something like this, and that forms part of the rhythm section. It's quite an interesting thing putting reverbs and delays as inserts as opposed to having them as sends. I just feel like we've had the CPU power to put relatively intensive effects on inserts for well over a decade. I don't really see why we should be limited by putting things on sends. And certainly if I was tracking lots of vocals and I wanted my vocals and my different flutes and things to have some kind of uniform reverb sound to them, I definitely get to the sends, but I think the flexibility of having effects as inserts makes perfect sense. And yeah, it's how I've just always done things. So yeah, this is basically, and you'll notice I've built this track up kind of the wrong way around. I've started with the synth parts and the percussive elements while neglecting the actual drum elements. The reason for this is because I've actually, and I'll just unsolo the kick and snare and hi-hats now. I've had to recreate my drums. Actually, these drum sounds were a combination of drum hits from various different sources that I'd kind of put together over the years, including my own 808 distorted snare and a clap, which was an amalgamation of a Nord drum clap and a Lin 9000. So I have this kind of drum library of drum machines which I've collected over the years, and rather than have them sit out in a track, I tend to collate them either in battery or this primitive plugin I use called Nerve, which again is from Xfer, and I think it's got all the right intentions, but it's got a lot of limitations, one of them being that there's only 16 steps, and in the sequencer, in order to play more than a bar, you have to cycle between patterns, which is just thoroughly inconvenient for me. With that said, I'll take my kick and snare and put them on this grid, and sometimes my hi-hats as well. So if I just solo the drum elements there, you'll see that the rhythm is really basic. It's a kick, an 808 distorted snare, my Nord drum clap, and obviously the 808 elements, which I showcased earlier. But when it all comes together, it sounds pretty neat, and it fits really nicely with the one-on-one bass. And like, none of this is really rocket science. I mean, this is all just about getting the sound sources right in the first place, using, you know, the bare minimum amount of plugins that just do a job and do it really well. And if you need to go crazy on processing, you've got the ability to do that with sequencer grids and stuff like that. But, you know, it's kind of really common sense, a lot of this. And you'll see from the relatively small number of tracks in here that, you know, there's not really much happening. And in the case of this Nerve machine, because it is quite primitive and restrictive, to replicate the rhythms I created with the drum machines at Handwerk Studios, I would automate this to mute individual hits in and out. And let's home in on these drum tracks a little bit and sort of see how little has been done here. In terms of the processing for the kick, we've got a bit of an EQ boost around 46 Hertz. The Waves REQ is my weapon of choice for that. It's really good at just dialing in those problematic frequencies. I tend to use it to boost more than cut. And then right in the middle here, we've got this quite substantial cut using the Cubase EQ at around 270 Hertz to get rid of the boxiness of our kick drum. The snare and clap are living on the same track. We've used this Steinberg room reverb again, very similar setting to that which we had on the SH101. Reverb time around 0.75 seconds. A little bit of work going on the EQ. There's a low pass and high pass filter in here. This has been adjusted slightly in Cubase 10, and to my ears it sounds better actually. This is, as I say, was one of my go-tos for years. Not much of it on the mix. The dry wet level is sitting at 17, which is sound about right for this. Waves L2 on top of the clap and snare. Not really much happening in terms of attenuation on that, but just enough to catch those clips and really bring that clap out. And something else I might consider for this would be like a stereo enhancer, which again, the Steinberg stereo enhancer does a job really nicely. And let's just take that back to just kick and snare and just give you an idea of how that rhythm knits together. And that's kind of, you know, these were like the basic, this was the basic drum setup for the entire record. Effects coming from the Korg Mono poly, kick and snare coming from Lindrum and various other instruments, knitted into Nerve and the 101, going through its group channel and the other elements. Yeah, it's interesting also to see how the Nerve drum machine is automated. I've got these mutes happening on the various different outputs where an element might come in and out, like a kick drum might be introduced in, introduced out, and I would literally just mute these across sort of 4 bars and bring them back in when the track drops. Really primitive way of doing things. And I think you could probably get a much better result if you just used audio tracks, but for some reason I like the flexibility of having drum hits in there. Towards the end of the track, I cut up the 808 congas a little. This is something I would typically do with my drum parts if they came from a loop. And I think there's something really to be said about keeping the loop within the drum machine itself for 8 or 16 bars. I think the inconsistencies of the rhythm, the fact that it jumps in and out and has its own groove, that's really important to me. In the past, I've clocked stuff from the computer, and a lot of the tracks were, probably about half the tracks in the record were made by using a dedicated clock source, either from something like the Roland SBX1 or from whatever MIDI interface I was using at the time. But I think for Handwerk, I just freely jammed the 808 parts, and just kind of got it in time with the track and built these sort of 8 and 16 bar loops and then just cut them up if I didn't want the groove. Like the 808 conga part that's playing through the entire track, that's definitely free jam. That's been cut into 2 bar loops actually, because that went out of time quite a lot. The 808 doesn't have a digital tempo, so you have to, you know, really play it by ear if you want to get it right. And yeah, I've just taken bits out. And you'll hear that like some of those conga and rim shots have simple hits as part of them. That doesn't really bother me too much. In the grand scheme of things, on the track, that's what the DIY thing tends to work pretty well. In terms of the mix bus, there's nothing massively crazy happening here. I tend to keep things relatively simple, as you've seen throughout the creation and mixing of the track. I like the mix I changed my tact a little bit on this. I used to always mix into a chain. Nowadays, I tend to just want to have my elements sounding loud and punchy at the source and leave the sort of in the box mixing to a minimum. And you'll see that in the Handwerk mix bus. There's a Waves Renaissance EQ here with a slight high pass filter around 30 Hertz. I've got rid of all the stuff that might still be lurking in there. Throughout the track, you would have seen that I'd filtered out low frequencies consistently in every track. So there isn't really a massive reason for this, but it's kind of just something I've done since I started out. I'll sometimes do this on the high end as well, where I'll get rid of stuff above around 18. Not really much point in having it there. And certainly with the analog sound sources, the primarily analog sound sources I've used, there isn't going to be much energy up there that's going to be replicated anyway. I use this Maserati groups thing here, which is horrific if it's not used properly, but I love the mastering preset, and I don't really do much to this, to be honest. I tend to have the needle so it's just moving. It's not something I would mix into. It introduces some latency on my system, and I think you might have noticed earlier as well when I sort of soloed the kick and bass channels that it tends to make things compress a bit too much if it's not on the entire track. So this definitely would have been something I would have introduced at the very end. Brought the low end up quite a lot. One of the criticisms of this plugin is you can't really establish which frequency you're homing in on. You just have to go by what their definition of low, mids and highs are. And this is a typical sort of smiley shaped EQ where you have the sort of low end boosted quite significantly, the high end boosted and the mids taken out. And then of course on top of that I would use the trusty Waves L2 with a minimum amount of gain reduction, usually sitting around 1.2. Sometimes I might bring a Nux in there as well and use some of the mix bus settings on there if I want some extreme compression going on, if I really want to hit the extremities of the mix. The drum companion's good. Degraded tape is one of my favorites for giving that kind of old school tape feel. And I wouldn't ordinarily put this on the mix bus, but it's a really cool preset to have. Just to hone things down a bit and not make them sound so like they've been summed together in a box. On top of what comes out of this project, I would then take that master and get a professional mastering job on it. I might take it to somebody like Matt Colton or Shane at Heathman's. Shane did the vinyl mastering and did a really fantastic job. The pressing plant did their own in-house cut and totally screwed it up, and I had to take it to Shane to do a bespoke vinyl master. But most of those mastering guys now are in the box, and there's not really anything in terms of processes that they're doing that can't be done here in the box. And I think what you're really paying for is the expertise, the years of their ears on dance records that work stylistically and in specific environments. And that for me is money very well spent versus relying on the technology that mastering companies have. Stylistically, you know, I'm not really sure what I was thinking with this. I mean, it kind of came together because of the limitation of the instruments that were in the room at the time. Obviously, with my own studios, with Principleasure, one of the big problems I have there is there's too much choice. There's too much to pick from. Handwerk was an amazing studio in the sense that there were about 10 synthesizers there, which is way more than anybody would need anyway. But the fact that you're kind of limited by what's there and to a certain degree, the presets, the factory presets and the factory programs that are in things like the Jupiter 8 and the Elka Synthex, some of those memories can be very volatile. The SH-101 obviously doesn't have any preset memories. So you're dictated to by the stylistic limitations of the synthesizers in a way. Obviously, my roots are firmly in what I call proper electro, classic electro, Juan Atkins, Drexciya, Aux 88, the kind of Detroit influenced stuff. But also there's an element of sort of 80s new romantic and the kind of music that was around when I was a very small child that plays an important part in this. You know, Vince Clarke, even Vangelis, and what he did in the original Blade Runner track, right through to some of the newer influences, Warp Records and R&S and Helena Hauff, what she's doing, and Lone, Daniel Avery, Dejatronic. Yeah, that's kind of how this all came about, really. Taking my past initial experiences with music and marrying those with how those early EBM influences and early electro influences are being used in a club environment and also a home listening environment nowadays. Arrangement-wise, I went for kind of a radio edit on this, around 3 minutes long. Handwork obviously was an album track, and in the past I'd been used to doing these 6 or 7 minute long, sort of 12-inch extended mixes, which I don't think are particularly useful anymore now. I notice DJs just switching between tracks a lot more and not really having much confidence in playing a track the whole way through. And also I think just limited attention span, Spotify generation, you kind of have to get to the point a lot quicker. With that in mind, and none of this is intentional, it's just how the track came together, it was a lot easier to pull this, to do this organically. I hate the idea of getting stuck in a 16-bar loop, 8-bar loop, and just having to layer elements together and overuse automation to try to keep things interesting. I can't stand music that has too much going on in the way of sort of listener tricks, and that definitely wasn't my intention with Principleasure. It was to have exciting sounds, sounds that I thought were exciting, coming together in a way that worked, I guess, in a club environment as well as it did in a sort of home listening environment. And I think this idea of sort of getting to the hook, if you want, sooner was definitely new for me. I came from a world where you'd have sort of 32 bars, 64 bars happening before anything really started to take shape. And these 8-bar sections tend to sort of flow quite organically, but we would start with the drums, as most tracks tend to, with some kind of drone element or some kind of high string, and gradually start bringing elements in with the bass line kicking in sort of after sort of 8 bars or so. I didn't really labor it out and want to have anything. I always find that if you wait too long before dropping a key dance floor element, it loses its sense of suspense and you just end up overblowing stuff. So in this record, the bass lines generally tended to come in sort of after 8 or 16 bars, and things tended to end, you know, relatively quickly around a sort of 2.5 minute, 3 minute mark. I've been using Cubase for as long as I can remember. It's been an extension of my hand, if you like, of my musical brain for pretty much most of my life. I started using, I think it was one of the possibly the first version, at least one of the very early iterations on the Atari ST when I was a little boy. And it just worked really well with what back then was an incredibly unreliable landscape. I remember Atari STs being used in big studios by many electronic producers well into the mid-late 90s because they were such reliable MIDI machines, and because Steinberg with Cubase had created such good timing, I suppose, with Steinberg. It just worked. It just did exactly what it was meant to do. And in those very early days, I used to experiment in very similar fashion to what I'm doing now, except obviously there was no dedicated audio recording. Everything would be put together in MIDI and bounced to a DAT tape or to a reel-to-reel tape recorder. The way in which I've used Cubase 5 through 10 has really not changed much over the years. It's a combination of MIDI and audio tracks, software instrument tracks and audio tracks, and for this record, primarily audio tracks. I think the big takeaway from this is that I wanted to make a record that relied primarily on vintage analog synthesizers, and everything was, more or less everything was tracked and created largely in the analog domain, with a few minor exceptions of using my own synthesizer zone, but my own soft synth zone. But Cubase, yeah, it's I think of it now as a very fancy tape machine that enables that perfect combination between MIDI editing and audio editing. And the way in which things come together has largely not changed for me for at least the last decade. I'd be as comfortable using a 10-year-old version of Cubase as I would one of the very latest, like Cubase 10. There isn't really much difference in my workflow. We're out of time for now. Come join us in part 2.